Welcome back to Singapore Property Talk Law, the show where we, get into all the details of Singapore real estate.
Hmm.
Today we're going deep on something that's been all over the news lately, right? Family property disputes.
Oh, for sure.
And to help us break down this kind of complicated area, I've got Serene here, a legal expert specializing in Singapore property law.
Thanks for having me. It's a topic that, can get pretty heated.
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing more and more of these disputes, like an average of 10 families every year ending up in court here in Singapore,
Right.
fighting over, like, who owns what.
It's sad.
And looking at all these case files you sent me, what really struck me is how often things go wrong when a parent, passes away.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden, these, like, unspoken family agreements about property just kind of fall apart.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely a common thing.
Yeah.
And it often comes down to how Asian families, traditionally view property ownership. There's like this collective mindset where assets are seen as belonging to the whole family,
Right.
not to individuals.
Like a family heirloom almost.
Kinda, yeah. So you'll have these situations where, like, kids contribute money to buy a place, assuming they'll inherit a share later, but without, putting anything in writing.
Right. So when the time comes to, like, actually divide things up, it becomes a he said, she said kind of situation. And that's when, well, the legal battles begin. I've noticed that two main concepts keep coming up in these cases, though, right? Gifts and resulting trusts.
Yeah.
Can you explain the difference and why they're so crucial to these disputes?
Sure. So a gift is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
If the owner can prove they meant to give the property to a family member, that person becomes the owner. Doesn't matter if they contributed financially, like in that case you sent me. With the father putting a house in his daughter's name, even though she didn't pay anything, the court saw it as a gift because his intention was clear.
So it all hinges on intent when it comes to gifts.
Exactly.
Got it. But what if, like, that intent isn't so clear? What then?
That's where resulting trusts come in.
Okay.
It basically means even if a property is, legally in one person's name, the courts can look at who actually paid for it
Right.
to figure out the real ownership shares.
So it's like, show me the money. And based on those financial contributions, the court can decide that someone has a stake in the property, even if technically they don't own it.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And this was like a big factor in that unfaithful husband case, wasn't it?
Oh, right.
He put the property in his wife's name, but he paid for most of it. So the court ruled that she held a big chunk of the property on a resulting trust for him.
Yeah. Yeah.
Meaning he still had a claim to it.
Even though his name wasn't on the deed.
Yeah.
That one really shows how complicated things can get, especially with, those unspoken expectations within families. And speaking of complex cases, the one with the gold bars really caught my attention. It wasn't about property, but about a husband transferring, gold certificates into his wife's name and then later saying he never meant it as a gift.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
A curveball for sure.
It's a good example of how, even with things in writing, you can still have disputes. The husband argued he didn't understand, what signing those certificates actually meant.
Right.
But the court sided with the wife, mainly because of the context. He willingly signed, didn't complain while his wife was alive, and there was no other evidence to suggest he didn't mean it as a gift.
So even with signatures, intent is still king.
Pretty much, yeah.
These cases are fascinating, but I imagine they'd also be pretty scary for anyone who's ever contributed to a family property,
Right.
without getting everything laid out legally.
Oh, absolutely. And
Yeah.
that's why it's so important for families to be, proactive. Don't wait till there's a fight to sort things out. Open communication and clear documentation are really key.
Okay, so we're talking about having those tough conversations
Yeah.
and getting it all down in black and white, but what about those other solutions you mentioned before? Things like co-ownership agreements and family trusts.
Yeah.
How do those help prevent these kinds of disputes?
They're great tools for families who, want to be extra careful and clearly define everyone's rights and responsibilities.
Okay.
Like with a co-ownership agreement, you can specify exactly what percentage of the property each person owns, how you'll share expenses, what happens if someone wants to sell their share, all that.
Sounds a lot more structured than just relying on those unspoken family agreements.
Yeah, definitely.
And what about family trusts? They sound, a little intimidating.
I know they can seem that way, but they're becoming more popular in Singapore. Yeah, basically, a family trust is a way of holding and managing assets for the benefit of specific people, usually family members. You create a separate legal entity to manage the assets, and you can outline exactly how and when those assets should be distributed.
Okay.
So, it can be a really effective way to protect your family's wealth and make sure your wishes are followed.
So it's like having a dedicated manager for your family's property, someone legally bound to follow your instructions.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
And it can be especially helpful in situations where, say, you have young kids, or if you're worried about potential conflicts, down the line
Yeah.
between family members.
Right, right. This is all incredibly helpful, Serene. You've given our listeners a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But I think the main thing here is whether it's through clear documents, open communication, or looking at those other options like co-ownership agreements or family trusts,
Mm,
taking proactive steps to protect your family's property. That's essential.
it really is.
Yeah. We'll be back after a short break to dig deeper into some practical strategies families can use to, uh, well, to navigate these issues and hopefully avoid those painful courtroom battles.
Right. It's all about preventing those.
Exactly, exactly. It's interesting, right? Because while those legal cases are uh, fascinating, they also show the emotional side of these property disputes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm thinking about that research paper you sent on elder mediation,
Right.
where it talks about like the guilt and resentment that can come up when families fight over inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like even with, clear documents, those underlying emotional things can still make things messy.
Yeah, that's a really important point. We can't just focus on the legal stuff without acknowledging the emotional stuff underneath it all.
Right.
I mean, think about it. Property is more than just like bricks and mortar, right?
Yeah.
It's tied to family history, memories, legacy, all that.
It's sentimental.
Yeah, exactly. So when these disputes happen, it's not just about who paid what. It's about, well, feelings of fairness, love, respect, you know?
Absolutely. And for lots of families, these conversations, they're tough to have.
They really are.
It's like that saying, where there's a will, there's a relative.
Exactly. People naturally feel, weird talking about this stuff,
Right.
but avoiding it just creates bigger problems down the line.
So, okay, open communication, that's key, we get it. But how do you even begin those conversations, especially with, like, older parents who might not want to talk about this?
Well, you start by, emphasizing that these conversations are about protecting the family's harmony
Right.
and making sure everyone's interests are looked after.
Mm.
It's not about, challenging their authority or rushing them into decisions. You could even say something like, Mom, Dad, I know talking about inheritance can be a bit uncomfortable,
Yeah.
but I think it's important for us to have an open conversation about your wishes for the property
Hmm.
so we can avoid any misunderstandings or conflicts later on. It's
Mm.
about protecting all of us.
That's a good approach, I think. Framing it as a way to keep the family together
Exactly.
rather than a challenge to their control
Hmm.
could make a big difference. But what if the conversation goes south?
Mm-hmm.
What if,
Mm-hmm.
siblings have different expectations
Right.
or start arguing about who deserves what?
Well, in those cases, it might be a good idea to bring in someone neutral, like a mediator
Okay.
or a family counselor. They can help the conversation flow, make sure everyone's voice is heard,
Right.
and guide the family towards a solution that works for everyone.
That's a great idea. Sometimes having that objective person there can really help cool things down and find some common ground.
Mm.
And I guess the same goes for if you're thinking about something more formal, like a co-ownership agreement
Yeah.
or a family trust, right?
Yeah.
Best to get a professional involved who can, walk you through it and make sure everything is legal and fair.
Absolutely. These legal structures can give you a sense of, clarity and security, but they need to be set up right to be effective. And having a lawyer involved can really help prevent any future issues.
Okay, so we've talked about open communication, legal documents, getting expert advice, but there's another thing we haven't really touched on yet. Financial planning. I'm thinking about those articles you sent over about retirement planning
Right.
and property asset management. It seems like having a solid financial plan in place could also help prevent property disputes,
Right.
especially as parents get older.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Financial planning is often overlooked, but it's really crucial.
Yeah.
Parents need to understand their own financial situation,
Mm.
their needs in retirement, and how their property fits into the bigger picture. If they've got a plan, it makes it so much easier to have those conversations with their kids about, what they want for the property and how they plan to manage their assets in the future.
So it's almost like having that financial plan gives them a roadmap for those conversations,
Yeah.
making it easier to explain their decisions to their kids.
Exactly. It also helps the kids understand their parents' financial situation better,
Right.
which can help manage expectations and prevent those misunderstandings.
Yeah.
For example, if a parent has a lot of debt or big medical bills, their kids might be more understanding if they decide to sell the family home to cover those costs, even if it wasn't part of the original plan.
Makes sense, yeah. Financial transparency can really help build trust and understanding in a family. It seems like all of these elements, communication, documents, expert advice, financial planning, they're all connected, aren't they?
They really are. It's about having a holistic approach,
Yeah.
to managing family property and making sure that everyone's interests are considered and protected. It's not just about avoiding legal fights.
Right.
It's about keeping the family together and making sure assets are passed down smoothly to the next generation.
Well said, Serene.
Mm.
You've given our listeners a lot of valuable information and practical advice. And I think the key takeaway here is that while dealing with family property can be tough and emotional, taking a proactive, informed approach can really help prevent those heartbreaking disputes that can tear families apart.
Absolutely.
It's been really insightful talking with you, Serene.
Oh, thanks.
Going through all these real-life cases and, expert opinions, it's clear that understanding how Singapore property law works, especially for families, it's so important for everyone.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's not just about knowing the legal terms,
Right.
but understanding how they actually play out, like in those cases we talked about today.
Exactly. And what I'm picking up on, and I think our listeners too, is that these aren't just like abstract legal ideas. They have a real impact on families,
For sure.
affecting their relationships, their finances, their future.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for families to be proactive. Don't wait till there's a problem to deal with these things.
So if there's one thing our listeners should remember from this deep dive into family property disputes, what would it be?
Start those conversations early and be open and honest with each other. Remember, the goal is to protect your family's harmony. Make sure everyone feels heard and respected.
That's such a powerful message, Serene. And I think it applies whether you're talking about property, money, or any other big family issue.
Yeah, exactly. Communication is key. And if those conversations get tough, don't be afraid to, get some professional help. There are mediators, counselors, lawyers. They can all provide guidance and support to families dealing with these, sensitive issues.
Well said. This has been incredibly informative and thought-provoking. And I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today, Serene.
My pleasure, really.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you the knowledge and the tools to safeguard your family's property and protect those important relationships. Remember, being proactive and informed, that's the best way to protect your family's future. Thanks for joining us on Singapore Property Talk Law. We'll be back next week with another, deep dive into the world of Singapore real estate.